Everyone. I'd like to wish you all an early Eid Mubarak, Kul Aam wa Antum Bkhair for those who are observing this weekend. Thank you for joining us once again for our third installment of our weekly webinar series. My name is Al-Arian and I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair US criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the war on terror. Our first episode, which you can find on the video section of our Facebook page and on our Civil Freedoms YouTube channel, focused on the COVID-19 pandemic in federal prisons and CCF's response in the Coronavirus Prisoner Release Project, where our legal team has been writing compassionate release motions on behalf of 30 vulnerable and elderly prisoners. Last week, we had the privilege of sitting down with the son and daughters of the 5 Holy Land Foundation prisoners who shared their powerful stories of trauma, hope, and survival throughout the political prosecution and imprisonment of their fathers. They also gave harrowing accounts of the inhumane prison conditions their fathers have suffered, both before and during the spread of the coronavirus. The case of the Holy Land Five remains one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in the modern history of the United States. 5 men serving unjust sentences ranging from 15 to 65 years, not for committing any act of crime or violence, but by the government's own admission for giving charity to the needy. Today's webinar will explore the political dimension of this legal case and a few others, including my father's own case, in the history of Israel's exploitation of the criminal justice system to target and persecute Palestinian American and Muslim political activists. In a number of cases that CCF advocates for, Israel played a big role in shaping them, supplying so-called terrorism experts, and bringing the manufactured crimes to US courtrooms. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our special guest moderator and a good friend of mine, journalist Nora Barrows-Friedman. She is an associate editor of the Electronic Intifada and the author of In Our Power, US Students Organized for Justice in Palestine. She has focused on Palestinian human rights issues as a reporter and broadcaster for nearly 20 years and has reported on the issues that will be raised in today's webinar throughout her career. I'm very pleased to turn it over to Nora, who will lead the conversation with our 2 guest speakers. Thank you so much, Nora, for joining us.
Thank you, Lena. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. And to this coalition, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. This is an incredibly important topic and one that cuts to the heart of US policy toward Israel and how this collusion creates massive censorship, oppression, and criminal injustice in this country and of course in Palestine. As has been documented for decades, Israel is a co-conspirator in the US government's quest to clamp down on and criminalize Palestine solidarity organizing, Arab and Muslim charities, and the right of free speech. We'll get into the cases of the Holy Land Five and the Los Angeles Eight, and Dr. Sami Al-Arian's firsthand experience being a political prisoner in a post-9/11 US. Before we begin, I want to remind folks to submit questions throughout the webinar, which we'll get to later. I believe that can be either in the chat or the Q&A. Yes, you can ask questions by typing in the Q&A box. In 2012, I interviewed Linda Moreno, who's the attorney for Dr. Sami, as well as the Holy Land Five. And she was talking about the sentencing of Ghassan El-Ashi of the Holy Land Five. And she said, we concluded this was a co-production with the government of Israel against these Palestinian men. It lacked all legal precedent and common sense. Let's start by having Dr. Sami and Miko introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into what this co-production, as Linda says, looks like and continues to be. Dr. Sami, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm so happy to see you, Nora, and so happy to see Miko and old friends. Yeah. I'm in Istanbul now, and I'm very pleased to have been part of the founding of the organization CCF back in 2010 when I was under house arrest. I was, obviously I'm Palestinian I grew up in Egypt, born in Kuwait, and I came to the United States back in 1975 and I stayed 4 decades. I got my bachelor degree, master's degree, and PhD. And then I became a professor at University of South Florida, starting in '86. And then, of course, because of all kinds of activism, especially in relation to Palestine, I was targeted not only by pro-Zionist groups throughout, but also by the US government. And for many years, they were after me, and I never thought that it would come to the point where they would charge the kind of charges I had to face eventually back in 2003. But just to make the long story short, there was a lot of pro-Israel groups who have been pushing the university, and that's what actually prompted this whole investigation, is because I was a tenured professor, and when you're a tenured professor, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to fire. I mean, the last major case before mine was Ronald Reagan and Angela Davis in the 60s. You could see how difficult it is to fire professors once they're tenured. So they came after, but the university president who was before the last one really resisted. And she had hired a lawyer, a very prominent lawyer, former president of ABA, American Bar Association. And he came with the conclusion there was absolutely nothing wrong. But after 9/11, with the new president who had her own connections to Israel, her family had her own foundation in Israel. She couldn't resist. They took advantage of an interview, and then eventually she suspended me. And then with a lot of pressure, and they were taking credit after that, I got arrested in February of 2003. And shortly after, I was fired because the university was about to be censured by the American Association of University Professors, which have meant really a death sentence to any university when that happens. So it was a convenient way, but she went out of her way to go to the U.S. attorney a year earlier, and this never happens. I mean, in the U.S. Criminal justice system, where they would be announcing the impaneling of grand jury. Usually this is done in secret. But in February of 2002, a year before I was arrested, they announced the impaneling of this. And then throughout my trial, I was amazed the amount of interference, the amount of stuff that Israel had to do. In fact, it's funny because the government had 400,000 documents in my case, on top of 470,000 hours of surveillance for over a 10-year period from 93 to 2003, and about 2,000 audio tapes and about 600 videotapes. And then they dumped on us 65,000 pages in Hebrew. My lawyer at the time, he said, "I'm not spending a penny on translating this. I don't care what it says." So, I mean, we can go into this, what else they had. My case had 75 witnesses. We presented none. I mean, I had 0 witnesses. But out of the 75, were 21 coming from Israel. Testifying to all kinds of stuff. And my lawyers, Linda, that you mentioned, and Bill Moffitt, may God rest his soul, they were very smart. They did not ask these witnesses a single question. They said, we have nothing to do with whatever they're saying. And if we get into this, I can tell you some of the outrageous testimony that was taking place during that trial. But at the end, we had a smart jury, and they refused to convict on a single charge, even though the government was asking, in my case, for 3 life sentences plus 220 years.
Amazing. And we'll get to how you became deported after all of that, even without this conviction, in a little bit. But first, let's go to Miko. Miko, if you could introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why you wrote this book that is wonderful. It's called Injustice: The Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Tell us how you got interested in this story and why it's an important factor in this topic.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nora, for hosting this, and it's a great honor to be in a panel with Dr. Sami, who I've known and admire for a long time. And thank you to the coalition for putting this together. it's one of those things that is rarely discussed. Even when people do discuss Israeli influence on American politics and so forth, they never get to the real down and dirty details. And these are certainly examples of the down and dirty details. My background is I was born in Jerusalem to a very patriotic Israeli Zionist family. As the title of my first book suggests, I'm the son of an Israeli general. And I've had all kinds of important Zionist figures in my family, including a president of the state. So I come from this very, very, I grew up with Zionism all around me, with the belief in Zionism, the pride in Zionism, and the belief that Zionism is, God's gift to the world and certainly to the Jewish people. But then, through all kinds of circumstances, I began to explore Palestine, and again, the title of the book, The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, as an Israeli discovering Palestine. And that journey, which began, I don't know, some 20 years ago or a little bit more, is still going on. And it began with visiting Palestinians in America, which was the first time I met Palestinians, and then going to meet Palestinians in Palestine, and then traveling to Palestinian towns and cities on my own, and kind of overcoming all the demons of fear and mistrust and so forth that were implanted in me. And then when so that's really my background. And then after the General's Son came out, my book The General's Son came out, I was in Texas, in Dallas. I gave a talk, and I was approached by some of the daughters of the Holy Land Five who actually invited me to speak. They were the campus organizers, and they told me the story, which was really unbelievable, just not believable. And they were all very excited because these were their fathers. These were people that they loved and cared about. And then after the lecture, I started looking into it, and I received a whole bunch of information. It was right at the time when their appeal was denied. And then the more I looked into it, the more I wanted to learn about it, because it seemed absurd. These are people who came to America decades ago, or decades before then, and went to school, raised a family, built a community, and decided to give back. And I met with the families eventually, then I met with the families again, and I decided to write the book. And so then I began meeting. I met 4 of the 5. I met Shukri, Mufid, Abdurrahman, and Mohammed Zain in prison. Hassan, I was never given permission to visit in prison. And the more I delved into it, again, the more unbelievable the story became. And the more I spoke to other people about it, I would get the same reaction. This is not possible. This is America. They must have done something wrong. Something must have, the government doesn't do these things. This is America. Which made it clear to me that a book has to be written about this, and this has to be exposed. So then I met with the lawyers, and I read probably 20,000 pages of legal documents about the case. And what came out was a story that was actually makes sense, and something that Shukri Abu Bakr, who was serving 65 years, said to me very early on, which is that it's all about the Zionist narrative. And at first it wasn't really clear to me, but it became clear to me why and how it's part of the narrative later on. And this applies clearly to Dr. Sami's case as well. Anybody who dares to challenge the narrative, which puts Israel as always on the right and Palestinians as either terrorists or innocent or victims somehow, but never allowed to express their identity, never allowed to express their desire for freedom and so forth. Anybody that tries to confront that narrative has to be brought down. Now, the Holy Land Five, they were dealing with charity. They were dealing with relief. They created a relief organization. But because they were doing such a good job, and because they were creating alliances, with so many other legitimate organizations, both nationally and internationally, because they were contributing. You know, they were there after the Oklahoma City bombing, and even after 9/11 and tornadoes and floods. I mean, they were everywhere. They really gained a lot of respect. That was precisely the problem, because they were changing the story. They were poking holes in the narrative. And again, a big part of the narrative, which I believe we need to reject wholeheartedly, is that there is such a thing as Palestinian terrorism, and that is the main issue here. I reject the notion that there's such a thing as Palestinian terrorism altogether. But regardless, they were not dealing with anything that had to do with politics. They were dealing with relief. But again, because they were presenting this case in such a good way, the Palestinian case, in such a positive light, in such a positive way, they were poking holes. And so the Zionists, as early as the 1993, 1994, were beginning to attack them and to spread lies and rumors about how they are terrorists and they're supporters of Hamas and so on and so forth. And of course, there was not a shred of evidence to support any of that. But the story, the narrative was the most important thing. That's why I think both in their case and in the case of Dr. Sami, they had to bring all these witnesses from Israel. And it had to be an overwhelming show from Israel, because how else do you maintain the narrative that, look, all these Israelis are coming, and begging us and supporting this cause because of this issue of terrorism, And of course, I'm sure in the 400,000 documents that they brought for Dr. Sami, there was not a shred of evidence, not one iota of evidence that he did anything wrong. But who cares? That's not the point. The point is you got volumes of evidence that people look at it and say, well, this is overwhelming. Obviously, there's something wrong. And I'll say one more thing, about the terrorism experts that were brought to the case of the Al-Arian Foundation. They were they were anonymous. So this is unprecedented also in the history of the United States, that the expert witnesses were able to testify anonymously. And even with all of that, when they were cross-examined during the trial, and I put that in the book, the exchange between them and the defense attorneys, they really had nothing to offer. They knew nothing. They were asked, do you know who the board members of the zakat of the committees are? Because the story changed from them supporting Hamas to them working with organizations controlled by Hamas. That was they changed the story during the trial. They changed the accusations. And so they were asked, do you know who the board members of these charity committees that you are claiming are part of Hamas are? They had no idea. Do you know who the previous board members were? No. Have you been to their offices? And so on and so forth. So they tore them apart, even with the fact that they were anonymous and they had all this, protection. But of course, we know it took 2 trials and eventually these 5 men were convicted. But I was just amazed at the fact, at the length to which Israel would go and the Zionist organizations are going to make sure that any attempt to contradict the narrative is brought down.
Right. And
this is one example.
Sami, I want to get back to you. Can you talk a little bit about some of, Miko was, brought up all of this ridiculous, so-called evidence that didn't point to anything worth prosecuting. But there were tens of thousands of documents, hundreds of thousands of documents in your case. Can you talk a little bit about some of these charges and this trumped up evidence that was brought forth, and
Sure.
and how Israel authored it?
Right. Well, as I said, I was charged along with my 3 co-defendants. Actually, were 9, but 4 were brought to trial. The 5 others were not in the United States. And overall, there were over 100 charges. For me particularly, there were 17 charges, 4 conspiracies. 3 of them asked for life sentences. One of them is RICO. These are the type of conspiracies that are usually charged to the mafias. And these are type of laws that came in the 1970s. It said, okay, we catch the little guys, we need to get the big guys. So they have these conspiracies they called RICO. And part of that is that they have what is called overacts, predicates, all right? One crime is enough. For the mafia, they bring, could be murder, gambling, prostitution, money laundering, you have it. In my case, it was maiming and killing Israelis and all kinds of stuff. I think they had about 10 charges. One of them was extortion. It's interesting that we had Edward Said's son as one of the lawyers. So he had little motion that he wrote. They said, who did they extort? So we had it. So the judge actually said, who did they extort? So the prosecution came and said, extorted land from the state of Israel. And then the judge said, no, you cannot extort an entity. You have to extort a person. So he knocked it off. He took it out. Then they superseded a year after, and they put it back in. So the judge asked the same question. He said, Judge, we found somebody that they extorted. So I was waiting, actually, who did they have? So during the trial, they brought an Israeli woman from Costa Rica. And she testified to the following. She said that back in 96, this was a trial in 2005, all right? So it said 9 years earlier, back in 96, she lost a sister to a suicide bomber. And because of that, she had a restaurant in Tel Aviv. 4 years later, in 2000, she sold her restaurant and emigrated with her husband and 2 children to Costa Rica. And that's the testimony. This is how I extorted her being in Florida. That was the testimony. I mean, it's amazing, but that's, as surreal this is exactly what was going on. Yeah. We had an Israeli banker, we had an Israeli librarian. Some of these publications that I used to produce back in the 90s, all these publications, one of them was called Islam in Palestine, one's called Inquiry in English. They brought all these publications, and because the publication in Palestine, they couldn't find an expert who can admit them into evidence. So they brought a librarian from Israel, so he can come and said, I read every issue. I published like 40 issues. He said, and then he started bringing this publication that I have. You would think you are in Nazi Germany or fascist Italy or something. This was in the United States of America. Not only was I tried on stuff that I said and wrote, I was tried on things because I was an editor of this magazine, on things that I allowed to go into that magazine. I was tried on that. In fact, some of these, the Israeli evidence that they brought in, they bring in all kinds of different information according to Israeli interpretation. So they brought in with their own biases. Meanwhile, we could not even talk about anything related to Palestine. Mm-hmm. So when the issue of 242 came about, my lawyer asked, can we ask about 242? Because he thought this is an opening to say there is an occupied. We couldn't even say that Palestine was occupied. That was irrelevant to the case. So when one of the phone calls they used, and we were talking about 242, and he asked what's 242, the government objected, and the judge sustained the fact that we could not talk about what 242 was. So if you were sitting in the trial, you would think these are some crazies who are supporting, not doing anything. The whole thing was that we're supporting what's going on as perceived as terrorist acts. During the trial, you would be amazed what the government was doing. They built a whole model of a 1995 suicide bombing that sat there on the floor, in the court, 6 months, that they were looking at. A bus station, a suicide car, all kinds of things. These are models, life-size models that were sitting on the floor. On top of that, there was a suicide vest with Hebrew inscription on it that was sitting in front of the jury for the whole 6 months. They built the whole drama inside the courtroom to give the jury, to actually bias the jury, that somehow they are inside a suicide cell, a terrorist cell or something like that. I mean, I can go on and on and on, the type of things that were being introduced. They were led to believe, which is a lie, that I opened bank accounts in Israel for suicide bombers. I mean, that was in the indictment. This is what they told, and they couldn't bring a single evidence. I've never been to Israel. How would I even if I were there, I couldn't even open a bank account, let alone in the name of 4 suicide bombers. I mean, it was crazy, but that's the type of evidence they were subjected to throughout. And as I said, when you go and read, the prosecutors admitted on the stand that they coordinated with Israel, and that they made more than 20 visits to Israel. When my lawyer asked the prosecutors and the FBI agents if they had ever been to the West Bank or Gaza or talked to a Palestinian during these 21 or so visits, the answer was no. Never once did they go and talk to a Palestinian. It was always. And then we found out from the WikiLeaks that the ambassador, the American ambassador to Israel, sent a cable back to the State Department thanking or giving credit how much the Israelis how cooperated, and not only cooperated, but they helped, they assisted in the prosecution of Sami Al-Arian. That was in one of the State Department cables back in the summer of 2005.
Amazing. And when they didn't get the conviction that they wanted, they tried a different route and ended up having to, basically settling for deporting you.
No, actually before that, because you have another prosecutor in Virginia who's very well known for his pro-Israel bias.
Yeah.
I had known him before even I was arrested. This guy had his eye on me. I was once in a meeting in the summer of 2002, and the FBI director at the time was Bob Mueller, and he was going to address that. And he came with him, and I had no idea even he existed. Then when he saw me, he said, "I'm not going to shake," because somebody was trying to introduce me. I was very prominent among many political circles at the time. And he said, "I'm not going to shake hands with someone whose hand who has bloody hands." I looked at him in shock. What is he talking about? He came later after the director's speech, apologized, and then he sat with me and he tried to bargain with me. "If you work with us and we'll do this, I can help you and this and that." And then he made me believe that I am about to get indicted and that he could stop it if I would cooperate with him. And I said, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? And then he said, and then I said, "Who is going to make this decision?" And he told me it's going to be made at the level of the Attorney General, which was at the time. At any rate, this guy is friends. He was very well known for his pro-Israel friends. He's friends of Stephen Emerson, the guy who's been after me since '94, he and his buddies. And of course, during the discovery, I saw so much information that these people were just, hand in glove between the government. Stephen Emerson, Rita Katz, another guy who died, Khaled Duran. All these are Israel's agents in the U.S. These are the people who are actually the mouthpieces that go around with very tight with Israeli intelligence. All these people were talking, and the FBI was getting the information and feeding them information. In fact, one of these journalists who's very well known also to be pro-Israel, was with the Tampa Tribune, which is defunct now, and he was talking to the FBI on first name basis, on our own phones. I can hear them, when I was listening to these phone calls, when they once raided my office and center, the guy calls him in the center, the FBI answers while they are conducting the search, and they are sharing information about what's going on during the search with the journalist. I mean, that tells you how much if they talk about conspiracy, how much that conspiracy was going on for years after, for years and years. At any rate, this guy, this prosecutor, when he didn't like the verdict we got from Florida, so he created another case for me. I spent 5.5 years. I had an agreement with the government. I will give up all my rights in the United States, even though I had been there for over 30 years at the time. I would give up everything and I would leave. And of course, they signed that. He didn't like it, so what does he do? He calls me to testify in unrelated case because he did that with someone else. And he thought that he could get it either way. If I don't testify, contempt of court, criminal contempt in the course of a terrorism investigation, minimum 25 years. And if whatever I say, if I had testified, then he's going to charge me with perjury, again, in the context of terrorism, at least 25 or more years. So either way, he's getting me. So I had to, of course, I go into hunger strikes and all kinds of stuff, and I refused to testify. I knew what his game was. And when he gave up, after years of civil contempt, more prison sentence, he charged me with criminal contempt, as we expected. But this time we had a decent judge. So for the first time, we had a judge who was thinking. He said, "This is ridiculous. You already had made an agreement with this guy. You are not two different countries, two different jurisdictions. This is the US government that made this. Why? I need to talk to these prosecutors who actually made the deal with him." And then he refused to bring these prosecutors. 3 times she asked for that, and 3 times he declines, even though he says that they were against what he was doing. These prosecutors who prosecuted me and wanted to send me to life in Florida did object to what he was doing. And yet, so the judge kept the case. I think the problem is that she didn't have the, I didn't say the courage, you know, she just didn't want to go against the government. So she kept me on a house arrest for another 5.5 years, and she refused in a district that is called Rocket Docket. You know, they never go, you know, they have to do boom, 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 you know, the cases. But she kept it alive for about 5.5 years until the government itself gave up and they asked for dismissal. And then I was deported. So twice they tried to get me, which is very unique in the US, where, you know, you go twice against the government and twice the government comes empty-handed. But yet I had to pay about more than 11 years of my life, you know, between prison and solitary confinement and all that. And we could tell one more anecdote about Israel. All these witnesses from Israel that came, 21 of them, they were, during their stay, they were, what's the name of that organization? The Women Zionist of America.
WITO. The Women Zionist of America, it's called WITO. W-I-Z-O.
Yeah. This organization actually was the one hosting them. And then the head of that local organization, believe it or not, was part of the jury pool. And we had to waste a strike on her because the judge would not dismiss her that she is biased, because she asked her, could you set aside your biases? And she said yes. So we had to waste a strike to get her out, you know, during the time. I mean, it was farcical. I mean, the whole situation, if it wasn't true, you would be surprised. You know, some of the evidence that the government entered was a dream of one of my co-defendants. And they read the whole dream to the jury. And what happened is that he dreamt that he had a conversation with me about Palestine. Whatever I told him, the next day he was talking to someone else in Chicago. So both lines were being monitored by the government. So they got both ends. That dream was read to the jury as evidence against me. And I was telling my lawyer, it's not even my dream. And I'm being asked basically to answer for this. I mean, this happened in a court in the United States of America. It would never have happened or ever happen if it wasn't for Israel. I mean, it's pure and simple.
And I think that organization also might have been Hadassah.
Yes, Hadassah. Thank you.
Yeah, the other one, right?
yeah, the local one in Tampa. They are the ones who actually hosted all 21 witnesses from Israel. And as I told you, the head of that organization was in the jury pool. And I didn't know that until I saw her and she introduced herself. And then during the whole trial, she was there in the courtroom.
Right. Just unbelievable, Dr. Sami. Thanks for sharing that with us. Miko, what goes through your head when you hear Dr. Sami's story? And this is only scratching the surface because, as he said, this was like over years and years and years of this kind of persecution by the federal government. You know, how does this happen? Why, just, you know, for people who don't live and breathe this every day, can you maybe analyze how Israel is allowed, invited, whatever it is, to collude with the US government to prosecute US citizens with impunity?
It reminds me a lot, you know, as Dr. Sami was talking, I took some notes, but it reminds me just the sheer volume of the attack, you know, the hundreds of thousands of documents, all the, you know, the bringing in all these witnesses and so on and so forth. It reminds me a lot when Israel carpet bombs Gaza or Lebanon. It's just sheer destruction. Who they kill, who they injure, who they maim is not important along the way. They're getting their point across. They are going to destroy everything and anything in sight, so that there's nothing left but, you know, charred ground. This is exactly the same thing. It's overwhelming power because they have no real argument. they have no way to justify what they do. So if anybody raises their head and poses a question, then they carpet bomb.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, of course, it's we see this in the legal system. Now, the reason they're, you know, I always say this, when people think of the Israeli influence, when people think of the Israeli lobby, they think of a bunch of people with suits in Washington, D.C. lobbying members of Congress and things like that. That's like only a small part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The real work is done in races for city councils, in races for mayors of cities, even small cities, in curricula, in the different high schools, high school, even below middle school. When you look at the history books, when you look at the books that deal with these issues, and so on, civic studies and so on. This is, social studies. This is how they operate. They operate from the ground, and they've been doing it for a very long time. They're very experienced. When somebody runs for Congress, they don't need to be lobbied anymore because they received it in school, they received it in church or at synagogue, they received it in Sunday school, they heard it at home, they saw it on the news, they watched the movies. So then they hear that there's this professor in Florida who's a Palestinian and a Muslim. Well, you don't even need the evidence anymore. It's a done deal, pretty much. On top of that, just to be sure, they carpet bomb. So they carpet bomb with hundreds of thousands of documents and so on, just to make sure that there's no ground left. There's nothing alive when they're done. There is absolutely nothing alive. In the case of the Holy Land too, I mean, it took them almost a decade to bring them down. And the tapping of the phones, and God knows how many hours of phone conversations that were tapped, and bringing a translator who didn't really speak Arabic well enough to provide a real translations, and then and on and on and on. And then basically at the end of the game also, I asked the lawyers, the defense lawyers, was there a conspiracy? Because this began with Holy Land Foundation, began with a civil trial. When the government closed them down right after 9/11 and designated them as a terrorist organization, they, the guys that were running it was Shukri and Hassan. The most amazing thing is that they were not concerned. They said, look, there was 9/11, Americans are scared, everybody's panicking, it's fine. We'll go to court and we'll resolve this. We can remedy this. We can undo this because look at all the evidence we have. We have all the evidence on earth that's possible, and they're meticulous in keeping records and paying, their tax returns and so on. So they weren't concerned. And then they went to the civil trial, and the judge dismissed the case and struck their evidence from the record. And this was not a particularly mean judge. She was a liberal judge. I mean, she was, So I asked the lawyers. I said, did somebody whisper in her ear? I mean, what's going on here? And then they appealed that decision, and the appellate court also said, well, perhaps you shouldn't have done this, that, or the other, but basically this is national security, so we're going to let her decision stay. And he said his opinion was that the judges abdicated. They abdicated their duty. And in the Holy Land case, that was when the lawyers realized that something is going terribly wrong, and that the profile that these men meet, with that profile, you're no longer going to get a fair trial in America. Mm. And just to be honest, and to kind of maybe open this, make it a little bit of a broader issue, when the book came out and I was touring, the title that we gave was The Erosion of Civil Liberties in America. And as I was speaking to audiences, who were minorities, blacks or Latinos and so on, Japanese who were older, there were never civil liberties to be eroded for those populations. So in other words, these Palestinian Muslims were now joined into this other very large segment of American society that never enjoyed civil liberties to begin with. Unless you're white and privileged, there are no civil liberties in America. And so that's when really that population joined the blacks and others in that reality. And then when you look at what happens today, and the Coalition for Civil Freedoms is doing a great job in supporting so many other cases that have taken place and continue to take place since then. But that's how they do it. They're very meticulous. They've been doing it for a very long time. They're very good at what they're doing. It helps that they're white. It helps that they look American and, and so forth. And it also helps that there are a lot of very prominent Jewish people who are Zionists, like in San Diego, for example. I lived in San Diego for a very long time. Some of the most prominent families that donate to libraries and donate to the symphony and, they're all Zionists. So when they come and they demand some, something that has to do with support for Israel, how can anybody say no? I mean, they're such good people. So, they operate on so many different levels that when you get to a case like this, you have a Palestinian Muslim, the case is pretty much, it's pretty much a done deal. That's how they do it. And then they carpet bomb just in case.
Thanks for that. I think we can take some questions and then, continue the discussion that way. Let's see, I'm going to go through the Q&A. Let's see. Okay, so someone asks, I hear all the time that everyone fears how Israel will react to criticism and the lobbies are to be feared. I want to know what exactly everyone is afraid of. Let's see, he goes on, in particular with the rampant accusations of anti-Semitism that they throw against anyone who dares criticize Israel is unprecedented. Maybe that's a good segue to open into kind of like how, this narrative of like painting all Palestinians as terrorists or terrorist supporters. Also, the flip side of that coin is painting all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. We've seen more than, I think it's now 28 states in the US that have passed laws intended to suppress speech critical of Israel, especially on college campuses. And that also includes support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. In Florida, where Dr. Sami used to live, Governor DeSantis, I think about a year ago, signed a bill. Actually, first, he went to the settlement of Ariel in the occupied West Bank. And there he received an award, honoring him for his commitment and dedication to Israel. He met with Sheldon Adelson. And then while he's there, he signs a bill essentially criminalizing criticism of Israel in the state of Florida. So how does this this interference, influence, collusion with Israel in the US criminal justice system, how does that translate into what we're seeing now in terms of like broadening the criminalization of Palestine solidarity, of the BDS movement, of even just speech that would say, for example, under DeSantis's law, you could be criminalized if you advocate for a single secular democratic state for everybody in historic Palestine. Dr. Sami, how do you see this like broadening of the criminalization here?
As Miko said, it's an attempt to stifle debate.
Mm-hmm.
What Israel is trying to do, because their narrative is so shallow, and the justification for the emergence of the state to begin with, and the Zionist justifications for having a state and all that, it is so shallow in relation to the Palestinian narrative. So they only have to resort to tactics where there is actually no debate. Mm-hmm. So what do? You try to basically taint the other side. You try to malign them. You try to paint them in a corner, especially if you have instruments of power. If you have better finance, media, politics, what have you. And that's what it is. I mean, the charge of anti-Semitism it doesn't even hold water. To say that Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians are anti-Semitic, they hate Jews, it just belies the historical fact. When Europe was persecuting Jews throughout the Middle Ages, the only place that the Sephardic or the Jews who lived in Andalusia found was in Muslim lands, and they were open, with open arms. My father grew up with Jewish neighbors, and before the Zionist movement took over, Palestine, they would be respecting each other. They would be trading with each other. My grandfather traded with Jews, and they lived there. I mean, we did not had this problem until Zionism became the aggressive movement that's trying to depopulate the Palestinians and take over the land. So, and then when it comes to the actual narrative, when we talk about what happened actually to the Palestinians and who was the victim here, that is never part of the debate that's being advanced. And when we talk about how this whole thing happened, actually even Jews of the United States, they didn't really embrace Israel fully up until 1967, in the aftermath of 1967 war. That's when the actual Zionist movement took hold of, unfortunately, the establishment, the Jewish establishment within the United States. And then we started to see, different kinds of narratives. And now even AIPAC and this it's been taken over by Licudists, by the right wing, by the settler movement. It's not even just liberal reform Jews and something like that. It's not even that. We're talking about an extreme wing of the Zionist movement that believes in total annihilation of the other side, like Ze'ev Japunski type ideology. And I noticed this change because I said I came in 75. I lived there for 4 decades. And right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, during that time, 89, 88, 89, 90, I could see that now there are Israeli agents who were positioning themselves to bring this next big threat. And I remember the first one who did that, his name was Yusuf Budansky. And he had some Mossad connections. And then he became somehow the head of a task force within Congress. It wasn't really Congress, but it was adopted by the Republican side. So it used to be called the Republican Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare. It used to be bipartisan, but the Democrats found that it is so extreme that they disassociated from it. And the guy who was heading it at the time was Bill McCollum, who was a congressman from Orlando, which was very close to what I used to live. So I went and visited him, and I found him, he was messianic, was really crazy. And then they started talking about, that the Palestinian and the terrorism and the Arabs and the Muslims are the next threat. And he started producing these different books. I'm talking about 89, 90, 91, way before, this whole thing, even people bothered. He had a book called Target America. And then he followed that up with, when he wrote in Canada, so that he can sell a Canadian and European, Target the West. And they started producing all these books. And then Rabin was elected. Itzhak Rabin was elected in 92. And he started talking about the Islamic terrorism. I was monitoring all this very early on, and I wrote, articles about it. And then this whole thing went, full force after the first World Trade Center bombing in 93. And then during my trial, reading the discovery that I saw now that the Americans started monitoring, different people, because somehow they thought that this is how they can protect America. And they didn't understand, what these people are doing. So they took whatever they were listening to Israeli intelligence, and they would write, they would translate to them and give them their own interpretation of what's going on. And all that I saw, it's actually, when you're in discovery, I mean, those who are lawyers would know this, you have 3 types of discoveries. You have the stuff that they got through legal searches, stuff that they can get either from people that they search their houses or whatever other public means. And then there are 2 other sides. One is called discoverable material, which is part of the investigation, but it is discoverable by law, and part that is not discoverable. Now, because of the sheer amount of evidence against me at the time, thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, sometimes they will put the undiscoverable into the discoverable. So while I was looking, I found intelligence reports during this. I wasn't, and it says, non-discoverable, even though it wasn't my, I had access to it. And it was amazing, the type of intelligence reports I read, not only, by the way, from the Israeli intelligence, but also from Jordanian and other Arab intelligence. The amount of cooperation and lies, and I say lies because I saw, one of the Arab intelligence organizations had a full report on me, was total lies. They were just giving them to what they would like to hear. It was just amazing. But and then I can tell you how high this went on. during these early years in the 1990s, the guy who was actually controlling these agents, Bodansky and Emerson, and later on Fichter and others, they may not even know it, was Yigal Karmon. Who was Yigal Karmon? Yigal Karmon was the prime minister's advisor on terrorism. He used to be with the Mossad. He would come in the United States and stays in Steve Emerson's house. He was directing this whole network. Now, people say, this is conspiracy theory, you're crazy. Let me tell you one anecdote that is amazing. Netanyahu became prime minister in 96. In 97, he had a visit to the United States in DC. Tampa is not particularly a well-known city. If you're a foreign leader, Tampa doesn't come to mind just out of the blue. If you have to make an example, you can talk about New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington. You don't talk about Tampa out of the blue. Of course, I was suspended at the time by the university pending an investigation. He was asked about what, the terrorism that Israel was facing. And what does the prime minister of Israel says? He says, what would you do if a bomb, goes off in New York or Los Angeles or Tampa, Florida? Out of the blue, Tampa, Florida. Why was Tampa, Florida on his mind? Of the prime minister? Because of my, they were after me in that. And then the next day, the Tampa Tribune, the newspaper that was recruited by Emerson to go after me. And by the way, if you had Googled, there was no Google at the time, but if you had went and tried to do a search on how many articles were written by this newspaper alone on the eve of my arrest, not even after, just before, it was over 1,500 articles. Over the type of onslaught they had on me, particularly in the month of November 95. That month was when they searched my house. There was an article every single day, front page. And if it wasn't the front page on Section A, it would be on the front page of Section B. And then even on Thanksgiving Day, November, we have last Thursday, Thanksgiving. What are you going to write about Thanksgiving? So they had on Section B, things you should be thankful for. The number one, that you're not Sami Al-Arian. And then they had to repeat all the lies again. When Timothy McVeigh, this is the type of thing that was directed, that's what I'm trying to tell you. And I could see from the interviews, and Rita Katz actually in her book mentions that, because they also, they were cooperating with. But on Thanksgiving Day, they had this story against me. When Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City bombing, they somehow convinced the US, the FBI, that I somehow was related. I don't know why. Because during my discovery, I see this report, summary reports by the FBI. Actually, my phone was surveyed live. At the end of the day, the agent wrote a note, said, I don't think he has anything to do with it. It was that crazy. It was that crazy that somehow they thought we had, and they can tell you how much the media is in cahoot with the government. I believe the bombing was on, if I'm not mistaken, was on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I get a call from ABC News 2020. And the correspondent was insistent that she wants to interview me. I said, why me? Out of, everybody. No, we think you have something you can contribute. And she tried. I said, listen, I knew this was probably because of Stephen Emerson, because he profiled me the year before. So I said, I will appear, provided that he will not appear. She said, no, I cannot give you that guarantee. I said, okay, forget it. The next day, she was right there in front of my door with a camera running for 2 hours, and I refused to open to them because all what she wanted to say, and this is on the eve of the Oklahoma City bombing, which would have been, at the time, the most horrific act of domestic terrorism. And she stayed there because all what she wanted to get a picture of me saying, get out of my property so she can show it. And the Tampa Tribune and the reporter of that Tampa Tribune, on the day that the government identified Nichols and McVeigh, on page 4, he said, I was behind it. It was that kind of, atmosphere that we had to live through. And then, eventually the university got with this, the government came with this fantastic conspiracy that they wanted to lay on me.
Did they ever issue a retraction?
Of course not. They would never do that. See, that's the problem, because in the US, if you become so-called public person, it becomes impossible to sue.
Right.
And if it's impossible to sue, you never get a retraction on anything. Actually, what they were doing, Stephen Emerson actually was pushing his lies. He went before a very prominent group in '96, and he said in public that Sami Al-Arian is behind the World Trade Summit of '93, and quote me on that. And I get all kinds of stuff because he dared me, said, go and sue. And of course, when I went and asked some lawyers, if I want to sue, what do I have to do? What do I have to do? He said, you need minimum of $50,000 in expenses that has nothing to do with our fees. And then you have to do this. It's impossible to sue and get anything. So they get away with anything. That's basically the law. And of course, if you are rich and you can intimidate, or you are part of this. And I think they were pushed even by the government. I think the government was trying to push many so that they can get me on the record to say something. And I mean, my case is so, I mean, it has so many twists and turns. They would send informants to me who would be extremely on the left, and others who would be almost neo-Nazis, try to get me involved with them. And I would discover them and kick them out of my office.
Oh, there's so much. They never stop.
No.
Let's see. Let's get to a couple more questions. We have one. Miko, someone's asking, wasn't the Holy Land Foundation declared non-terrorist by the US government a few years ago? Can you talk a little bit about the updates in the case and whether that happened and what that means for the defendants that are still in these?
I haven't heard anything
Yeah.
Like that whatsoever. If they were now no longer terrorists, then they could be. Then well, that would change everything. That means they'd be they could come out.
I think what he's referring to possibly is that years before they were indicted, the Holy Land Foundation was certified by US aid to give aid to Palestine.
Right.
And of course, US aid is part of the US government, US information. And maybe that's what he's referring to. But you know, the US government, in terms of the prosecution, they don't care about what other agencies may even say. Because even the highest ranking American, I'm sure Miko can elaborate on this, he testified in their trial.
Yeah.
We're talking about the person who was representing the US government in Jerusalem. He testified on their behalf.
Not only did he testify, and we're talking about the U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem.
Right.
And it's probably worth mentioning the U.S. Consul in Jerusalem until this whole mess with moving the embassy took place. So now nobody knows what anybody's supposed to do there, which is kind of ridiculous. But originally, the U.S. Consul General of any country in Jerusalem is a status of an ambassador. They don't answer to the embassy in Tel Aviv. They answer to Washington, D.C. because the diplomatic missions in Jerusalem predate the state of Israel, and they are independent missions. They mostly operate as missions to Palestine. So he was probably the most important, or the highest ranking witness that the defense had. And he not only said, that as far as he knew, the Holy Land Foundation did fantastic work, and they were never, ever, there was never any directive not to work with them. Even though there were directives not to work or support Hamas-related organizations, they were doing fantastic work. And when he was also asked about the information, the intelligence that the U.S. gets from the Israelis, because as an ambassador, he would have CIA briefings every day. And he came down and really said that the information, the intelligence that America gets from the Israelis is tainted and politically motivated, and so on and so forth. In the second trial, he was not permitted to say this. There was a gag order, so he was not permitted to say these things on the witness stand. But in the first trial, he said all these really, really damning things about the nature and the quality of the Israeli intelligence. But no, they still, if now with the coronavirus and with their advanced age and with all kinds of circumstances that normally they would qualify for some kind of, sentences or something, but because these are terrorism charges, the terrorism charges, if they drop those, boy, we'd be having a party now.
Yeah.
But I don't see that. I don't see that as something happening. I'll just say something about the fear question. I think what Dr. Sami just described is precisely why people are afraid, because Israel goes to such lengths. And we had a discussion, a webinar a couple of weeks ago about the politics and how Israel interferes in especially in progressive politicians and brings them down. And we have the example of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Bernie Sanders here. And the Zionists are taking a lot of credit for both of their falls. And these were two men who are relatively progressive on the issue of Palestine. And they were really very close to leading their countries. And the Zionists, of course, are taking, so what activists say, people are saying perhaps, is look, if they can do this to people, somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, if they can bring down and stop somebody like Bernie Sanders, then what are they going to do to me as an activist? And I will add also that the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, who's in charge of the fight, Israel's fight against the Palestine Solidarity Movement and what they call the BDS, his name is Gilad Erdan, and he's coming to the U.S. now.
Yep.
And he's taking a lot of credit for what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, taking down with all the anti-Semitism charges. I mean, this was carpet bombing of UK politics, an intervention in such a horrifying way that it's really hard, somebody's gonna have to write a book about that. But he's taking the credit for that. That was a big success for him in his office. Now he's coming to the US as a double, with two positions, as ambassador to the US and as ambassador to the UN. So we can expect the doubling and the tripling of the effort against free speech when it comes to Palestine here in the United States. But at the same time, and not that it was by any chance, weak or over these last few years, as you said, there have been attempts to silence people who talk about Palestine. At the same time, I have to say that the pro-Palestinian voice on campuses is robust and is growing by the day. And more campuses are starting SJPs and organizing events. I had events with the University of Washington yesterday. And immediately when the legislation against boycotting Israel started, every state practically that passed this legislation, the next day I get an invitation to come and speak. And this is particularly noticeable in New York and New Jersey. I think in New York, the government signed it even before. It was an executive order. I was invited to speak on campuses immediately because people felt that this was the answer to that. So the fight goes on, but I certainly I can understand why people are afraid. Certainly if you're an Arab and a Muslim and you've heard about Sami Al-Arian, or if you've heard about the Al-Arian Foundation 5, you've got a good reason to be afraid. And if you're an activist and you want a career in diplomacy, in the State Department, and anywhere, you certainly don't want to have this as a stain that you were, somehow targeted. Although, I'll add this, at the end of the day, those that stand with Palestine are going to look back with pride. And those that stand with the other side and accuse people like Dr. Sami or the Al-Arian Foundation or all these other good people that have never done anything wrong, they will have to, they will live in shame and will have to explain why and how they could possibly stand with such evil. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to reverse.
I wanted to give a special shout out to Linda Moreno, who is one of the participants in the audience. She says, she had the great privilege to represent both Dr. Al-Arian and Hassan El-Ashi in the Holy Land 5, the two most remarkable clients in my 40-year career. So thank you so much, Linda, and for being a part of this.
And I have to say, all the attorneys that I spoke to made similar statements about their clients, about these clients. Yeah. They all do. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I met some of the lawyers, the sense was, I would do anything, I would give anything if I knew it would get these people out of jail, to reverse this.
Yeah.
I want to thank Linda, of course. Linda and I have been good friends now for 17 years. It was my good fortune to have someone like Linda. because I didn't, of course, know Linda was working in a law firm headed by one of the biggest Zionists actually in the state at the time. But he was one of the biggest firms, and I had a lawyer at the time, very good, prominent lawyer, but he was solo practice. So he said, I cannot defend this case on my own, so I have to get somebody, and I'm gonna get you the biggest one. So he goes there and talked to this guy who comes in, and he says he's gonna give me one of his best lawyers, which was Linda, and I was very fortunate to have that. And all what he actually wanted to discuss was money. And then he immediately, and I knew this later, he was called by his rabbi and says, listen, if you're going to defend this, we're going to excommunicate you. So he had a good deal. He said, I'm not going to defend him, but he sent me his best lawyer. So, and then of course, Linda says, I can't continue in this capacity. I said, please resign and come. She took a chance on me, because obviously we were still collecting money. This was a huge monumental case. And she said, listen, you don't need a local lawyer. You need somebody from the outside. She knew the system pretty well. And fortunately, I had met Bill Moffett back when I was campaigning against secret evidence. He was the head of the criminal law association. And I met him briefly, and she knew him, and somehow we connected and we were able to bring him in. And it was a fantastic team effort between Linda and Bill. And of course, we had 7 lawyers on the defense team, including, as I said, Wadia Saeed, Edward Said's son, and it was wonderful. And it would have been impossible, to defend this case if I hadn't very good, a good legal team. Justice in America is very, very expensive, and you need really good lawyers to get through. But unfortunately, also the system is stacked against you. I mean, we saw she was also the attorney for Ghassan al-Ashri, and we know what happened there. They were railroaded with all these things that Miko talked about, the anonymous witnesses and a biased judge and all that. So the bottom line is Israel has great leeway in these cases. Now, we haven't even touched upon those who are called expert witnesses.
Yeah.
In my case, you had Matthew Levitt, who works for WINEP.
Oh, we had him too.
Institute for Near East Policy, an organization that was spun off AIPAC, was headed by Martin Endick at the very beginning. And then he testified for 1 hour. It was just surreal. And you know how much he charged for that 1 hour? How much? Because my lawyer asked him to understand how much he made, how much he was paid by the FBI. $250,000 he was paid, because he had to spend, I don't know how many hours, 2,000 hours or something outrageous, studying the case and all that. And then you have the Evan Coleman of the world, those people who were, and all these people who go in and out with Stephen Emerson. And thank God that eventually the Supreme Court said that Evan Coleman is not an expert. So every time, and I think he was involved something like 15 or 18 different trials. Most of them are convictions. All of them actually are convictions. Now, all these cases will have to be retried because they brought somebody like him who's totally biased, who knows nothing about the area. He doesn't even speak the language. He doesn't even have a degree in any of that. And the government was using him as the expert witness. And all these people, what is their common denominator? What are they all having? They're all not just pro-Israel. They're
not expert witnesses in terrorism. They're expert witnesses on how to sell Zionism.
Yes, exactly.
In the case of Matthew Levitt, I remember reading, and I put that in the book. I put his testimony in the book because some of the things that were said were, one of the accusations was that the Holy Land Orphan Support Program was not only was supporting terrorism, but he said it was not only supporting terrorism, it was encouraging terrorism. And the rationale is that if a Palestinian father or mother or somebody in the family knows they're going to get a $50 a month stipend, then of course they're going to become terrorists and blow themselves up and kill people because $50 is a lot. You know what I mean? That was the kind of rationale. And the distortion of the history and the distortion of the facts and the distortion of the reality, and never mind the fact that the orphans that were listed in the indictment did not become orphans as a result of anything that could remotely be called terrorism. None of that has anything, was even brought forward. The only thing these people know is how to sell the Zionist narrative. And for that, you should be paid, I guess, $250,000 per trial. He made a lot of money. With Holy Land. It's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of testimony. But that's really what their expertise is. What is this nonsense about being a terrorism expert or counterterrorism expert? When you look at what they actually talk about and what they actually write about, is to inflate the narrative and make it sound worse and worse and worse, and push the whole issue that Palestinians are terrorists and Israelis are good guys. That's really all it is. It's really shocking. I put his testimony in the book, actually, verbatim, and his exchanges with the lawyers, because it's beyond the rationale. Is beyond belief. It's beyond science fiction. I'm glad you brought him up, Dr. Sami. His testimony is, I follow him on Twitter too. I mean, the stuff that he writes is just bizarre, completely bizarre.
And Linda reminds us of the expert witness in the Holy Land case, Avi. That was a pseudonym. Who was a Mossad agent, and he got to testify anonymously, which was unprecedented, and I think still remains unprecedented.
And as I was researching the case, as I was working on it, I came across the website of the Shabak. The Shabak is the Israeli internal police, the secret police. And there was an article there where they were congratulating themselves on the great work that their agents had done in the Holy Land Foundation case. And I put that in the book as well. They're actually congratulating themselves because their agents were out there, and there were two. And one was an agent, I believe, for the Israeli military intelligence, and one of them was the Shabak, I believe it was the Shabak. But anyway, they were congratulating themselves on a job well done, even though, and again, I put that in the book too, the exchange, the cross-examination of these guys during the trial, they were torn to pieces. They were clearly not experts on anything. They had not visited the offices. They did not know the board members of the COT committees. They're supposedly expert in terrorist financing and things like that. And, with all the, God knows how many documents of evidence, thousands and thousands of pages and everything, there was not a shred of evidence that anybody did anything wrong or that these experts knew anything about what they're claiming to be experts. But I believe, and I remember this is one of the first things that the families told me about, and I forget right now which one it was, Avi or the other guy, said that they don't need to know all of these things, like who the board members are or visit the offices or anything of that, because they can smell Hamas. They're such experts that they can smell Hamas. And when I interviewed Mohammed Anati, who was the Holy Land Foundation, who was their office manager in Jerusalem, great guy who was just beaten and tortured and just traumatized beyond belief. His story was, first of all, it took me forever to find him because he was so traumatized he didn't want to talk to anybody about the case. And it took a long time before he actually agreed to speak to me. And his father told me to leave him alone, and it was, and I don't blame him for that. He gave testimony that when he was interrogated, that Holy Land only gave based on need, not based on any political affiliation. They did not give to any political or military groups. And in the translation that was sent here to the United States, his testimony was reversed. And the document said that he actually said that they did give preference to people who were associated with Hamas. Anyway, and I'm sitting there and finally got him, and we're sitting in this coffee shop in East Jerusalem and talking. And he allowed me to record, and he was finally calm. We sat with a mutual friend, and he said, for them, if you have a beard and you walk by a mosque, that's it, you're Hamas. That's all you need to have a beard and walk by a mosque. For them, you're Hamas, and that's precisely how this was done. And the amazing thing is that it stuck. In other words, yes, it took 2 trials, it took almost a decade, but at the end of the day, the judges in Holy Land, particularly the second judge, just allowed all this stuff to come in because, and again, according to the lawyers, the people that I spoke to, there was no real conspiracy. They abdicated. Ralph Nader interviewed me about this case, and he said, well, it sounds like the second judge was a hanging judge. This is kind of what he said about that. But the system allowed this. In other words, the system allowed this to take place. The system was willing to accept all of this nonsense that is clearly nonsense. You don't have to have a law degree. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. But you read the transcripts, and it's shocking. Like you're saying, that these things are actually arguments that are being taken. This is testimony that is being allowed, that is taken seriously in a court of law. That's really what's so shocking, that the system allowed this, the system survived and allowed this to happen. And then upon appeal and another, you know what I mean, the whole appellate process still allowed this to go on. In other words, you can't just blame a certain judge or a certain jury. This went on and on and on. It was well known, and nobody said, stop it. This is not supposed to happen. This is not supposed to be politicized. But again, like I said, you know, I believe it was John Boyd, one of the lawyers for Holy Land, said, you know, this is, the judges abdicated. They absolutely abdicated their duties. And I'll say one more thing about the lawyers, since we're talking about the lawyers, just real quick. You know, when I first heard about the case, it seemed like a pretty simple case. How are they convicted? I mean, obviously they did nothing wrong. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to see that they did nothing wrong. And before I met the lawyers, I thought, well, who are these lawyers? And then as I met the lawyers, I never met Linda personally, but as I read the transcripts and I met the lawyers, this was a stellar team of legal experts who tried to defend these people. Yeah. And then, you know, there are cases there where they're just sitting there holding their heads going, this is unbelievable what's being done to our clients. It is beyond the law. It is not something that we can deal with the legal tools that we have. This is far beyond that. And that's exactly the problem.
We only have maybe about 10, 15 minutes left, but I wanted to kind of pull back a little bit and talk about how long this kind of persecution of specifically Palestinians in the U.S. has been going on. We remember the case of the LA 8. I believe that was in the 90s.
88.
The 80s. The 80s. Yeah, time is
1988. Yeah,
slipping these days. Dr. Sami, can you talk a little bit about who the LA 8 were and the relevance and significance that case has had on your case, the Holy Land Foundation case, and kind of, you know, since?
Yeah, it was probably one, if not the first cases of targeting political activists. It was, and you know, William Webster was the FBI director. It was during the summer of '88, which was the last year of the Reagan administration, and it was during the last years of the collapse of the Cold War, and also because at the instigation of Israel, these were activists, Palestinian activists in the LA area, Los Angeles, was 7 Palestinians, and a wife of one of them was Kenyan.
Right.
And they were raided and arrested and hauled away. And the problem was secret evidence. We had no idea what they were charged with. And we had to deal with secret evidence for over a decade. You know, a campaign that I worked pretty hard between 97 and 2002, up until my arrest, right after 9/11. After that, so the problem was we had no idea what it is, but we had also very good prominent lawyers who were defending it. You know, the head of it was David Cole, very well-known Georgetown constitutional lawyer, and they won their cases. Eventually, it took 2 decades, 20 years to win, and it was all based. Even the judge at the end, and this was in the immigration courts, by the way, and then went into federal court, and went all the way to the Supreme Court, I believe. But the problem was that we had no idea what the evidence was, and it was politically motivated. And David Cole wrote a book recently, pretty good book. I think it's called, I believe, Engines of Liberty, in which he, I think, takes about 3 or 4 cases, and he dissects them and said, the problem, of course, he doesn't say that, this is my conclusion, is that American courts do not know how to handle political cases, because they think that there are no political prisoners and there's no political cases and everything is according to the law, which is not the case. David Cole's argument is that most of these controversial issues, they have to go through at least 3 phases. And I can testify that in the secret evidence, we went through 4 phases, actually. The first phase is the phase of the public opinion. And he talks about abortion, he talks about gay rights, he talks about gun laws, race issues. So you have to win your argument in the public opinion. Because of the public opinion is now tilting towards a certain particular side, then the politicians would react accordingly because these are their constituents. The last one to move in the country is the law, is the court system. And I think this is where the problem is. is that the tilt, the bias is so much towards Israel and its narrative and its agents and its construct of the conflict, is that no one questions it. And certainly not the politicians, and certainly, of course, not the courts. So everybody is deferring basically to that narrative. And therefore, when they deal with issues of law related to political activism, they do not consider that at all. These are no political activists. These are either terrorists, in which they have to be punished to the hilt, or they are innocent, meaning that they were not involved in any kind of political activity, because by nature there is no political activity. This is either terrorism or you're good, you're with the government. And of course, if you are at the center, if you're somebody who is taking a stand, a courageous stand, whether it's against apartheid in South Africa, or against massacres in Bosnia, or against the Rohingyas, or the Chechens, or the Nicaragua, the juntas, or whatever it is, you're not looked at as a political activist per se, because it's what the government defines terrorism. It's the government defines who is the good side and who is the bad side. And right now the Palestinians are terrorists, and therefore this is how the courts look at it. And that's problematic, because the moment you're into, I mean, if you had seen the type of circus I had to live through, at the beginning, actually when they indicted, they didn't arraign me like everyone else. They kept me for about a week or two aside, and then I was in a federal prison under the most horrendous conditions you can think of. I call it Guantanamo Plus, and plus is basically being on US soil, so you get a little bit of privilege, 15 minutes a month for one phone call. But they took me in a helicopter. There was sharpshooters on every end, as if someone is gonna come to rescue me somehow. And then you had this helicopter going in and out, and they wanted to steal me. I wasn't even on a seatbelt. I was flying inside a helicopter with the doors open, and all the marshals, they had these seatbelts everywhere, and I was going, and I was of course handcuffed from behind, and I was trying to stick to me because I was about to be thrown from that. It's all this circus. And then when you go to the courthouse, they have sharpshooters on top, on bottom, all these barriers. So they built this atmosphere of fear, like we had terrorists around the corner coming to take over, all that to influence the jury. The moment the trial was over, this whole thing was disbanded and was gone. That tells you the type of atmosphere, the type of environment the government tries to create in order to sell this illusion that somehow we're under attack, and to sell the narrative, which is a false narrative to start with.
It reminds me of something, it's not totally related, but it is, because it's about Palestine. The hype, the sharpshooters, the big guns. When, if you visit the old city of Jerusalem, there's a lot of settlers there, unfortunately, and they've taken over Palestinian homes, and so they've got, and you can tell the homes that were taken over by settlers, because suddenly there's, instead of this normal doors that you see in the homes there, you see a metal door, a really strong armed metal with special locks and a key, a little keyboard, a little keypad for and there's an armed guy standing outside. And then when people come out, and sometimes it's a kid going to school or something, I don't know, you'll see a little, like a Jewish kid walking, or two or three, and they're like surrounded by armed guards. Palestinian kids run around the old city all the time, right? It's their playground, it's their home. They go to school, they come back. They're never worried about needing protection. You know what I mean? That is the narrative. You know what I mean? This is like, we have to, if we're among them, we have to fear them. And the Palestinians, it's their home, it's their city. They don't need the protection. And who are the ones that are actually being arrested and beaten and attacked and killed every single day, even in the old city of Jerusalem? These are Palestinians, But the hype is part of maintaining and boosting the narrative, if you will, because you've got to get that, because they're terrorists, and they're so serious terrorists, and we're talking about people who've never had a military force. Palestinians never had an army, right? But that hype is precisely how they maintain this, and they spend a lot of money. I mean, think of the resources it takes to maintain this, but they have to do it. Otherwise, why go through the trouble of putting a professor from University of Florida, from Florida on trial for terrorism? If he's not such a terrible terrorist, and we don't have to worry, and we don't need sharpshooters, then maybe it's not so bad. They have to do that.
Yeah, right. I wanted to ask one last question, but before I did that, I wanted to once again encourage people to buy and read Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. That's Miko's book. And if you can find the incredible film on Dr. Al-Arian's case, it's called USA versus Al-Arian. I believe it was like on Netflix for a while. I don't know if it's still there, but I'm sure you can find it
It's online available.
Yeah, good. It's phenomenal. Dr. Sami, is there a book? Someone was asking if there was a book about your case that's out. Yeah, you should.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I was going to ask that. When are you going to write the book?
Yeah, exactly. Good.
I certainly hope soon. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn there, especially in prison. I learned so much about so many things. U.S., American people have no idea what it is to be inside the prison and how much injustices are taking place there. It's just beyond belief. People are being railroaded, especially minorities, particularly African Americans and also Latinos. There's no justice for these people. If you are poor in the United States, good luck, you're done. And there are people who are profiting actually from this plight. I saw really bad things happen to people who may have been on the wrong side of the law, yet they don't deserve what they had to go through. But also I saw the cruelty of the system. And this is something I might add, that I think most people do not see the importance of the Supreme Court. Sometimes this is an afterthought. No one thinks about presidential elections and the Supreme Court. And I can tell you this, during my trial, I represented myself for about 3 months before I was able to get Linda and Bill on board. And during that time, I was denied, even though I was representing myself, and the judge ordered that I represent myself, I was denied the basic things: pens, papers, access to the library, law books, and they did everything in their power to make sure I don't do that. I don't get that. And then during my research, I was going through most of the cases that settled prisoners' rights. All of them, almost all of them were 5-4. 5-4 against prisoners' rights. The privacy, the amount of invasion they do to people inside the prison is beyond belief. I mean, I was shocked, frankly, when you get arrested, you've never been in that part of, in society, and you have no idea what's going on. Prison in America today is modern day slavery, period. I mean, people have no rights, very little rights. Constitutional rights are almost suspended there. They are under the control of people who are sometimes sadistic, to say the least. And you have zero privacy. There's no privacy whatsoever. And of course, that in the name of security. But why that happened? I mean, I saw that most of the minority opinions were written by Thurgood Marshall. Many people forgot who that person is, a giant in the American legal system, person who was actually on the side of the Board versus Education, the landmark decision that allowed integration later on. This particular person who was always writing in the side of the minority about prisoners' rights, because he knew what they had to go through, mostly African Americans. And because you had some conservative judges who were appointed out of privilege, and they had no concern whatsoever about what people go through in these, we lost most of these rights. And I can tell you that if you get another Trump or another right-wing person on top, you're going to live, people are going to live for the next 50 years in curtailing most of their liberties and their rights, and they would live to regret it. So I hope that is taken to heart. If I have one more thing to say, probably at the end, I can probably say more. But in terms of the book, this is one of my projects, and I promise to finish it one day and have it available.
Good. Well, the last question I had is, like, what can people do? People who in the audience today are listening to the stories, your firsthand experience, Dr. Sami, and the stories of the Holy Land Five, who are in dungeons in the U.S. prison system. Talk about the work of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, but also like what can people do? What do we do with this outrage?
Well, if you ask me, I would say operate on two levels. In terms of support, and this was brought up last week when the children of the Holy Land Five were speaking. They're encouraging people to write letters, to write to them, to show their support. Like you said, the life in the conditions in these federal prisons is not anything that any of us could possibly imagine. I mean, I visited them, and walking in as a visitor, you feel like an ant that somebody's going to just step on you, not even care, and nobody's going to know, and they have all the rights. And that's as a visitor, And then to leave them there and go, and you see these people in these horrifying prisons, and and these are not only innocent people; these are the finest people I've ever met, and they are living in these conditions with with sadistic people who are on both sides, both guards and inmates. I mean, it's beyond belief. So to write letters, to send pictures, to for that aspect of it, and to show support. On the other level, I would say, in this particular issue that we're discussing here, people have to understand that supporting the cause for justice in Palestine is far greater than just, some war at the other side of the world between these two people who can't get along. Because this demonstrates, the cases that we're talking about today, Dr. Sami and the Holy Land Foundation, demonstrates how severely the issue of Palestine is impacting life in America, to a point where it's not just intervening in politics, it's intervening in the judicial system. This is the sanctity of the judicial system has been completely destroyed. And when I talk to Shukri and Hassan, all of them actually, all five, they all know that they're political prisoners. And there was a moment there when President Obama left office, and they were thinking whether or not there was a serious campaign to try to get him to commute their sentences and maybe deport them or whatever. And they asked me what I thought, and I said, these men are going to be released when the political prisoners held by Israel are going to be released. This is the same story. There is no difference between why they are in prison and why they are in prison. They're in prison because they're political prisoners, because they're Palestinians, because they're Muslims, because they stand, on the issue of Palestine on the wrong side right now. If they were white, if they were Jewish, if they were Christian, if Dr. Sami was not Palestinian, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't have been talking about it. There would have been no story here. The only reason they are going through this is because they're Palestinians, because they're Muslims, and because of the political atmosphere that was created here in America by supporters of Israel. So get on board on the issue of Palestine. Make sure that your elected officials get on board as well. Make sure that politicians start supporting the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions, the BDS cause. Fight this fight, because this has impacted life in America to a degree that most people can't even begin to comprehend. Like you said, we're scratching the surface here with the stories of these two cases, and it's beyond belief. If I was to write a book that I wanted to, it would have had 10,000 pages in it, not 200 pages, the book that I wrote. And the same, I'm sure, goes for Dr. Sami's book. I mean, how do you even start? So unless people get on board with the politics, unless people get on board with fighting for justice in Palestine, none of this is going to end. It's only going to get worse. And now, the signs are, with the Israeli government and with a new ambassador coming to Washington, that, the attacks are going to be far more severe than they've ever been. And the assault on civil liberties, and the assault on freedom of speech, and the assault of anybody who tries to stand up for Palestine or for, people like the Holy Land Five is going to be far, far worse than it ever was. So we need to gear up, and we need to get involved in the politics, and we need to talk to people, and we need to organize, and we need to stand up. And I think elected officials at all levels city council, mayor, state legislatures, every single level need to be talked to. They need to be approached. They need to know that there's a coalition here that demands ending these ties with Israel, ending the deadly exchange. You know, all of these things are out there. We need to just let more people know, and they need to understand how severe it is. That, you know, in the case of Dr. Sami, a good, caring, loving, you know, one of the finest human beings we'll ever imagine, has had to go through this hell, and his family with the young children, you know, and the Holy Land Foundation 5 and others. People need to understand, just comprehend just how serious this is, how severe this connection with Israel is, and how damaging it is for Americans and for the United States. And until they understand this, it's not going to happen. So those of us that are within, and like you said, do live and breathe this every single day, it's incumbent upon us to spread the word and to broaden the coalition and to support people who are doing this, support the students on campus, support the people who might be harmed by this, and encourage them to continue. Because on the other end, at the end of this, those of us who do stand on the side of justice are going to be very pleased that we did. And the people, you know, and our kids, children, and grandchildren ask us where we stood, we're going to be able to say, yes, we stood on the side of justice, and the others are going to be hiding in shame in some, you know, in some corner. So I think it's really, really important to get engaged in the politics of this and demand justice for Palestine and justice for Palestinians everywhere, including here in the United States.
Thank you, Miko. Dr. Sami, any last remarks?
Sure. Thank you very much. I echo everything, of course, Miko said. I think he said it very eloquently. We have a struggle that's going on. One side, one arena is in Palestine, in Israel, but also a bigger one in the United States. And I believe if we win in the United States, the injustice in Palestine would end. And that means that we cannot quit. I mean, I think what happened to me was meant to be a lesson to others. But I think people to know also that we prevailed. You know, they wanted me in prison, and that wasn't to happen. So we need to be courageous. We need to stand up to what's right. We need to speak up. We need to bond together. We need to start organizing, mobilizing, and going the full force. I believe that things have changed in America. I lived through the eras where no one would mention Palestine. Today you have at least half, if not more, of the Democratic Party activists calling for justice in Palestine. I think that those people in the Republican Party, those people who don't really see the struggle the way it is, a lot of them really don't give they're not concerned about the people of Israel. They're not concerned about their biblical view, some of them, at least the evangelical part. But I think these people are also going to wake up, and they know that democracy in America is being eroded, free speech is being eroded, all the things that they thought they had is being eroded, and I think people are not going to stand up to that, for that. You know, I think eventually people are going to do what is right. So we have to work on education, we have to work on reaching out to people, and that's basically what we were doing. I mean, if you had been in my courtroom, you would have seen the type of evidence that was presented. It was rallies that we had, conferences that we attended. You know, a lot of these conferences, they bring speeches from it, and what we were talking about. You know, they would be newspapers I edited, or magazines, articles I wrote, or lectures. You know, so it's all stuff that you think these are First Amendment activities, but yet these were being looked at as being threats, either to the system or to Israel. We need to do more of that. We need to overwhelm them with the truth. And when we do that, it will be very difficult for them to fight. And I think I see the tide going. You know, every day I see that people are no longer afraid, especially with these alternative new kind of media. You know, I see Electronic Intifada, for example. I mean, Electronic Intifada is doing a terrific job in informing the people, and even have all kinds of coups in terms of what's going on. It's this battle at the beginning that we have to win, the battle of the hearts and minds, the battle of the public opinion, the battle of the common person in the street. Now you have more than ever people supporting the rights of Palestinians, and I believe that's going to increase. I believe we were there in the 70s and the early 80s when the apartheid struggle was difficult, and at the end it was like a tsunami. It took everybody, including the president at the time. When he even tried to veto it, he was overridden overwhelmingly by both members of Congress. So I think this is where we are. We just need to keep our eye focused on what needs to be done. We win the public opinion, the education, the media, and then the politicians will start responding. And in terms of the law, you know, it's very unfortunate that you may get a courageous judge here and there, but that's going to be difficult. But we still have to rally around the victims. So with that note, I wanna ask everybody to support the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. It's the only organization in the United States today that is willing to stand up and reach out to these families of victims, the families of political prisoners. There is no other organization, Muslim, non-Muslim, you name it, doesn't exist. Everybody is afraid to touch these people. This is the only organization that dared to stand up, and actually many of its members and many of its executives are victims themselves. So they understand what it means to be a victim of political persecution, and that's exactly what's happening. So at least the least we could do is to support these people, is to give them support, whether financially or otherwise, or time, or volunteer, or spread the word, whatever it is. This is a very important task that no one is doing it. And with their work, they also have different departments. One of them is advocacy, trying to get relief to some of these people who have been railroaded by the system. There are hundreds of people in prison today, and the only reason they're in prison today is because of the political opinion, association, or belief. And that's wrong. And I think it's instinctively people know that this is wrong. It shouldn't happen in America. Yet it's happening, and it's happening more frequently than should be. So my final word is thank you very much for this program, but also please, for something good to happen from this, we need to work harder for justice in Palestine, and to work harder to release our brothers and sisters behind bars by supporting the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sami. Thank you, Miko. Thank you, Lena, and the wonderful tech geniuses behind this, and the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. There are links to Miko's book and to the entire documentary, USA versus Al-Arian, in the chat. So be sure to check those out before you log off. But thank you all for being here, and forward till justice.
Thank you.